Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas and to the Stoic Saturdays. We have a really special series. I'm very excited about this. This is Greg Lopez is going to walk us through his book, the Handbook for New Stoics. He's going to do 6 meetups himself, and then I'll be working with several other people to lead other meetups based on the book. So we're going to really learn how to do the Stoic exercises, how to integrate Stoicism into our lives. It's going to be about a 12 to 13 weeks course of how to do that. And we're going to have guidance of Greg in actually leading 6 of those and giving us some tips on what other things we should do when he's not leading. All right, so that's the plan. I'm very excited about it, and I'm going to hand it over to Greg. Greg, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me, Shrikant. I appreciate it. And thank you all for coming today and dipping your toes in the waters of practicing Stoicism. So if you happen to be here today for kind of like Stoic theory, like what is hupolepsis mean, and what are impressions and fantasia and horme, and did the Greeks steal prolepses from the Epicureans, and all kinds of theory like that. We're not going to do much of that. What we're going to do is learn just enough theory to dive into practicality. And so, as opposed to some of my previous appearances here, this is going to be relatively short on the lecture, although in the beginning we made it a little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to break out into breakout sessions using Zoom briefly for you guys to try to work through the suggested exercise this week, which is going to be week 1 from a handbook for new Stoics. And then you guys could come back and also share your experiences as well as answer any questions which may be more prominent in your minds once you actually try your hand at a practical exercise. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be kind of focusing on the practice. And so we're going to have practice-oriented questions. And so if people ask Q&A about like theory, maybe I'll answer it, but I actually also may discourage it depending on how theoretical it is, since that's not what we're here for currently. If you'd like to discuss theory, I run another group which is currently online, the New York City Stoics, which could be found on Meetup, and we just read from books. So if you want to do some book learning, you're welcome to stop by there or go to a lot of other meetings. But over here, we're going to be focusing on practice. So I'm going to go through a select few exercises over the course of the next several weeks from a Handbook for New Stoics, which I co-authored with Massimo Pigliucci. And we're going to start at the very beginning with week 1. But before we do that, I kind of wanted to give a basic argument, which you'll find in the introduction to a Handbook for New Stoics, which is inspired off of some of the ancient arguments for Stoicism. But it's not necessarily, you won't necessarily find it in there. It's kind of a more modern argument. And it's also somewhat inspired from the Socratic dialogue, the Euthydemus as well, where you see something that's kind of similar to what we're talking about here. But it's essentially an argument for Stoicism, which is a philosophy of life. And so a philosophy of life is I would kind of put it as a set of lenses from which you choose to view the world. So, and hopefully like these lenses, they actually adjust your views of the world in ways that make it clear and more, with more fidelity to what's actually going on, rather than obscuring views. But the goal of the exercise for the first week will be actually to try to have you explore this for yourself. So you can actually pick up these different lenses by which you view the world and inspect them and kind of make sure that they're free of blemishes and don't distort things before wearing them for the rest of your life. And that's kind of what a Handbook for New Stoics is about in general, and what we're going to be doing here over the next several weeks with me coming on and off in order to help guide and answer questions about some of the exercises. So before we get into it, probably behooves us then to think about why anybody would necessarily want to be a Stoic in the first place. What makes it likely, or at least more probable, that this pair of lenses that you can hold up and view the world actually would be helpfoland so we put forth an argument that we refer to in the introduction as the best bet argument, that the things that Stoicism try to guide you to do in life tend to provide you with the best bet for living a happy life. And so the main thing that Stoicism kind of recommends, or at least one version of Stoicism from Epictetus, the slave-turned philosopher, philosophical teacher, who is one of our major sources for ancient Stoicism. One of the things they put an emphasis on is focusing only on what's in your complete control and holding everything else that's not in your complete control much more lightly. And that's kind of a lot of Stoic practice in a nutshell. But the question is, why would one necessarily want to do that? And so the theory is that, if you get the things you want in life, you'll tend to be happier. And if you tend to avoid the things in life that you want to avoid, you'll also tend to be happier. So essentially, if you try to train yourself to only want things that you can control completely, you'll literally always get what you want and always avoid what you want as well. You'll essentially always get your way. And so focusing on only what's in your control is a good bet in order to be happy, essentially. And that's not a complete argument in and of itself, because maybe when you think about being satisfied by something, there's something in modern probability and modern economics called utility theory, where you have to kind of think of two things in parallel when deciding how much something is worth. One is the chances that you can get it, and that's kind of what Epictetus is focusing on. But there's also the reward, how beneficial the thing is, and if the things that you could get in life and be guaranteed to get in life, if those things tend to be really crappy, it may actually be a better bet to go against things that you can't always get. You're not guaranteed of getting, but those things are really good. So for instance, if I gave you a bet and said you have a choice, you have 100% chance of a penny or a 1% chance of $1 million, which bet would you take? I'll give you 2 seconds to think through the math, but I think if you multiply 1% by $1 million, the expected value of that second bet is going to be, hopefully I won't embarrass myself, $10,000. So you have a expected value of a penny or $10,000. So it would probably be better to take that second bet, because even though you're not guaranteed to get it, then still it's worth a lot. But Stoicism also comes back here and says that the things that they want you to focus on, the things that are actually in your control, are actually more valuable than all the other things you can get. And the reason for that actually comes in large part, or is put most clearly actually in the Platonic dialogue, the Euthydemus, in my view. And there, Socrates makes the argument that things like your character are necessary. Having good character is necessary to make good use of any of the things that come your way by luck. So if you become wealthy, you can be, it may not necessarily be to your advantage, because maybe you'll use that wealth to harm yourself or others around you. Or maybe it's a precarious wealth so that you're always going to be fearful that you may lose it. Or perhaps getting a little bit of wealth kind of cues you to want more, and you get on some kind of hedonic treadmill where you just want more and more and are never satisfied. All those are possibilities, and all of those, according to Stoicism, can be corrected by focusing on what's in your control, which is directly connected to your character. So the Stoics argue that focusing on your character, which is completely in your control, at least in the longer run, is the best bet for happiness, because you'll always get what you want, because you could always nudge your character in certain directions to shape it over the longer term. And it's also a precondition for any lucky things that happen in your life for you to use them well. You can't use them well for your own happiness or the benefit of those around you without having a decent character to start. So character's the things that's the best bet. It's the thing to focus on according to Stoicism. But that's in theory. And what this first week's practice is going to entail, which is in week 1 of the Handbook for New Stoics, is for you to start exploring this for yourself. Because if you pick up this pair of lenses called Stoicism and see there are scratches all over it, or you put it on and it distorts things like a funhouse mirror, maybe you don't want to wear that set of glasses. It's at the end philosophy of life, not a religion. And so you don't have to take it on faith that you should focus on things inside your control only, and that's the best route to happiness. A lot of the exercises in the book are meant for you to explore this for yourself. So that's why that's one reason for taking on Stoicism, and it's a somewhat modern one. So I'm going to turn to week 1 of a Handbook for New Stoics and read the quote on which it's based, and then I'm going to actually read a vignette which is given at the very beginning of the chapter, and then break you off into breakout sessions to discuss the vignette and perhaps the exercise a little bit. And that's how each chapter of a Handbook for New Stoics is structured. There is a vignette, which kind of gives you some motivation for the exercise. From a modern perspective, a lot of them tend to be first world-ish problems, but some of them aren't necessarily. Things like death and illness affect everybody. And then we follow it up with a quote from which we get the exercise. Massimo and I actually came up with this book because we've run something called Stoic Camp NY for, I think it's been 6 years now, and we dug up exercises from all these different, all the different major Stoics, and then we had a big pile of them, and so we sorted through them, buffed them up a little bit, and made a book out of it since it was already there. In a Handbook for New Stoics, we have a vignette that inspires the exercise, a quote, then there is a theoretical explanation of the quote, then practical exercise that is given. And it actually has some space to write in, because your goal really is to sit down and practice. As a philosophy of life, if there anything you want to get good at in life, you really do have to kind of give some conscious practice, or at least immerse yourself in it unconsciously. You could sort of do that for language, for instance. You could just dump yourself in a culture and try to start speaking the language and don't allow yourself to speak your native language. That is one way to learn it, although helping yourself out to some grammar and stuff to start with and maybe the alphabet if you don't know it, or the script may be useful. But that's one way to learn things, and that's one way you could do Stoicism. But a lot of things that we have to get good at require conscious, deliberate practice, and that's kind of the goal here. So if you just came to today's lesson and kind of want to hear about it and then let it sink in, but not really do it. I mean, if you don't want to do Stoicism, that's fine. But if you actually do want to practice Stoicism, then I'm really highly encouraging you to practice it. And when we do our second round of breakout sessions, I'm going to encourage you to use that time to plan with your breakout session partners how exactly you are going to practice and during what time frame you're going to do it, to make things as specific as possible. So let's start with week 1 of a Handbook for New Stoics and the quote on which the exercise is based, which is one of the most famous quotes from Stoicism. It's from Epictetus's Enchiridion, which means handbook, roughly, in the hand, thing that's in the hand, handbook. And it's from Enchiridion 1. And the translation that we use in the book reads, "Of all existing things, some are in our power, and others are not in our power. In our power are thought, impulse, will to get and will to avoid, and in a word, everything which is our own doing. Things not in our power include body, property, reputation, office, and in a word, everything which is not our own doing." So in a Handbook for New Stoics, we do unpack that quote a little bit, but I wanted to add a couple of things here that may bolster. I want to emphasize a few points. The first is that this quote is in a sense very precious because it gives you a specific list of things that Epictetus is claiming is within our power. And if, as you practice with week one's exercise, which is entitled Discovering What's Really in Your Control and What's Not, this list may help serve to bolster your thought about it if you get stuck. In fact, I might as well just kind of say what the exercise is right now. The exercise that's suggested for week 1 is for you to sit down at the end of each day, or perhaps at the beginning of the day, looking back on the previous day, whatever you want to do, and think about something that happened earlier in that day or yesterday. And probably something with a little bit of emotional valence, maybe something that you desired. Maybe you were spending a lot of time shopping, for instance, or eating nice foods or things like that, or maybe something that you wanted to avoid, things that got you upset for some reason, things that were difficult or upsetting. Either one will do. People, especially, it tends to be easier to work with things that you're averse to start, because that's kind of why a lot of people initially come to Stoicism, although kind of the full training tries to get you to focus on both reducing your desires and your aversions. But a lot of people just come to Stoicism looking to reduce their aversions at first, which is one way to approach it. And so aversions may be easier to work with since a lot of people are kind of familiar with them and have motivation to want to reduce them anyway. So you just look back on a specific event that happened in the past, last day, earlier that day, whatever, and then you write a little bit about it to kind of like remind yourself of what it was, and then you try to break that event down into things that are completely in your control and things that are not completely in your control. And so this is where Epictetus's list from the Enchiridion could play a role, although you don't have to use it during this week's exercise. You could actually just try to go with complete control and what's outside of your complete control and just go with that. But sometimes that's hard, and so having some theory guide your writing could help. So you sit down, think about what happened the previous day, and then try to separate things out into what's under your complete control and what's not under your complete control. And so complete control means complete control, meaning like you're 100% guaranteed to get that part of it right if you tried. That can be a little difficult, and sometimes what I've done in the past is like, sometimes there are things that are like 99% under your control in realistic situations. And sometimes I like put a little asterisk next to that to say that, yeah, it's not technically under my complete control, but I could still do it. One example of that could be, I could say something to, like, for instance, if somebody's doing something that's upsetting me, it's like, I can start a conversation with them. And like, I could literally say words to them in order to start a conversation about talking about the thing that's upsetting me. And that's like pretty close to my complete control. But I guess if somebody taped my mouth shut or kidnapped me or something like that, then I wouldn't be able to start that conversation. And so it's more useful in the longer run to probably focus on things that are under your complete control. But if you want to give yourself some slack and just give in your list, list things that are under almost your complete control, maybe just put a little star next to it to remind you that it's not under your complete control, but realistically it's like 99% there. So it's still not a bad bet. So week one's exercise is just this, and you can do it for a week or two or however much you'd like. It is sitting down, reviewing your day, taking an emotionally salient, either positive or negative event, and splitting it into what's under your complete control and what's not. And the aim of this exercise is for you to determine for yourself whether Epictetus's list is really true or not for you, or perhaps you could put it in a way that makes more sense to you and continue the rest of your Stoic practice that way, in a way that actually seems more true than the list that Epictetus gave. When you do this, if you sit down each day and actually do this, a lot of people do find it's actually more difficult than it sounds. And so if you find that to be the case, then you can start using a couple of theoretical guideposts in order to help. One comes from Enchiridion 1, the quote that I just read. You could try to separate out these your event, into the list that Epictetus gave. So he specifically says that in our power are thought, impulse, and the will to get and avoid. So breaking that down a little further, thought is one translation of hypolepsis, which essentially means more opinion or something, kind of like your opinion or viewpoint, something that you buy into. Ultimately, we have complete control over what we think is true and false. And that's kind of what hypolepsis is getting at. So that's in our complete power, that we can at least cognitively, you don't have to necessarily feel it in your gut, because a lot of Stoic training is about training your gut to agree with your head. So, but this thought part, it may not be emotionally that you feel something is true or false, but at least in theory you agree that it's true or false. It's like, for instance, if you're drinking a lot, you could in theory say like, yeah, this is bad for my health and relationships. It may be, that doesn't mean it's going to go away now that you've said that to yourself, but that thought, that thinking, like cognitively, at least I agree that I would like to stop this, that it's doing more harm than good to me and those around me. So, okay, I'll go for it. Again, doesn't mean it's going to go away overnight. That's what kind of the practice and training entails. But we do have complete control over what we buy into, what thoughts go through our head, and what we believe and don't believe. That's what Epictetus is saying there. He also says we have that impulse is in our power. And that's just simply how we choose to act. It's not How we act, that's not in our complete control. For instance, if I wanted to be more eloquent than I currently am, I could have the aim to try not to say so many ums. That doesn't mean I'm going to do it. But the idea of wanting to reduce that, that is in my control. I could at least aim for that. That's impulse. So you can aim for things, you're not guaranteed to get them, but where you direct your actions is in your complete control according to Epictetus. Again, the point of this week is to test it out for yourself. And finally, the will to get and will to avoid, that is desire and aversion. Essentially, that means what your goals are in life, what you want to get more of in your life, and what you want to push more out of in your life. So those are our goals, and those are under our complete control. So what we buy into in our heads, as well as how we want to act and what we want to get, those are the only things that are under our complete control. So that is, and everything else kind of isn't. So if during your week of practice, where you're going back and reviewing a specific event in your day and trying to separate things out that were in your complete control versus not in your complete control, you could use that list to help you if you need a booster. Another booster is presented in chapter 1, where you could separate out things into external events and internal events. That's another way to separate things out if you're having trouble. Not if you're not, then you could toss this advice out the window, because again, week 1's about exploring for yourself. But if you're having trouble, you could also try to separate out what happened into external, internal events, things that kind of go on in your head versus things in the outside world, and put the things in the outside world in the not under your complete control column, and put the other ones in complete control. But there is a caveat there, because that's a little sloppy, because not everything that goes on in your head is under your complete control either. If you try to remember something and it's on the tip of your tongue, but you can't quite remember it, that's actually not under your complete control. The initial stirrings of what we'd call emotion are not under complete control. If there was a loud sound in your room right now, if your ceiling just collapsed, you'd be startled and go around. No, even the Stoic sage wouldn't remain completely calm. They'd jump for a minute. They just wouldn't buy into the fact that this is a threat. Because again, thought, opinion, according to Epictetus, is under our complete control. So the sage would not continue to act as if the thing were dangerous and bad, but they would get startled. Initial thoughts that may be either desirous or like maybe cruel that pop into your head automatically, those aren't under your complete control. How you work with them is whether you want to buy into them or whether you put the effort to examine them. That's under your complete control. The fact that you just called somebody a bastard in your head automatically actually isn't. It's just a result of a long amount of practice and previous experiences. And we're not aiming to actually change that too much in Stoicism. What we're aiming to do is to recognize them as hypotheses and then work with them. And that's kind of what these several weeks are going to be leading up to. But we're starting with just kind of separating out what's really in your control and what's really not. So that is kind of the basics of how I wanted to present this week's exercise. I also want to give one more tip, which is in the book, about how to actually work with these exercises. I strongly, strongly recommend that you come up with a very specific plan in advance. A lot of you come to probably a lot of other kind of self-help meetups and stuff, and a lot of you may be familiar with SMART planning. If you're not, I'll go over it briefly, but coming up with a SMART plan may be useful. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed. One of many ways to break it down, but that's my personal favorite. So specific means that it's a clear plan that you have, not like, I'm going to practice week 1's practice this week. How, when, what are you going to specifically do? What are the steps? That wouldn't be a specific plan. M is measurable. How many days a week are you aiming for? Are you aiming for just 5 and taking the weekends off? That's cool. Lay it out ahead of time. Are you aiming for just 1, and if you don't like it, then you're going to stop? That's cool too, as long as you lay it out ahead of time. But trying to make a plan that you could meet can be useful. So it has to be measurable to some degree. Achievable means it's doable. If you really don't like doing anything on the weekends besides watching Netflix, then cool. Don't schedule doing this exercise on the weekends. That's fine. That is achievable for you. Weekdays are fine, weekends are not. I know I have trouble meditating on the weekends sometimes, and I let myself go. I have a little mini pattern that I allow myself to do and count myself as having still meditated just to keep the habit going, but sometimes that's what I got to do because that's what's achievable for me. So make sure that whatever your plan is, it's doable. R means relevant to your goals and your wants. Maybe the Stoicism stuff, maybe you're like, wow, this book sounds terrible and I don't like Stoicism. I'm going to go be an Epicurean or a Zen Buddhist. Okay, then it's not relevant to you, your goals. And why do something that you don't want to do if you have no good reason to do it? Like, there's a lot of other things out there, and I definitely don't hold it against you. In fact, at the end of the book, we say, like, we think like giving a year of practice and sampling the practices is giving a thing a fair shot, because at the same time, I think that probably if you just did a couple exercises here and there, like, I don't know about this Stoicism thing, I'm not sure if that's like a full effort. Like, this is a philosophy of and for life. It's not signing up for it's not a like simple and easy thing. It requires constant drilling. It's kind of like learning a language or learning a dance or something. You can go to an intro class and learn some basic steps in a dance class, but in order to become a dancer, you actually have to put in a lot of time and deliberate practice in order to do it. And that's kind of what Stoicism is. So I would encourage you to give it a go, but if it's not for you, then it's not for you, and therefore it's not relevant. So that's the R in SMART. And then timed, having a time frame. Are you going to do it for just a week? Are you going to go do it for 2 weeks? And also, when are you going to do it in the day? Having a specific time or a specific event that precedes when you want to do it is useful. For instance, if you brush your, if you brush your teeth every night, and then you could do it after I brush my teeth, I'll spend 5 minutes journaling about this. That would be a useful kind of SMART plan, because it's timed and it's not necessarily at a time of day. You could also say at 11 p.m. I'll do it, but maybe timed could also be like after an event that you do, as long as it's a specific time. So you're laid out exactly when you're going to do it. That is my final tip for you guys. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is actually start practicing this just a little in breakout sessions. And how you're going to do this is to kind of work with the vignette that is in the beginning of week 1, where it just gives a fictional character and some problems she's experiencing. And what I want you guys to do is to spend 5 to 10 minutes actually trying to help each other out, breaking down what's in this person's complete control and what isn't. So you're going to actually try the exercise that you'll be doing for your own experiences over the course of the week, but you're going to be doing it on a fictional person, which hopefully makes things a little better. In some senses it does. It brings some removal. It also may make things a little harder, because sometimes you don't have enough detail, and you may not have enough detail about who this person is and what their person's life experience are. If you find that to be the case, feel free to make it up, fill in the blank. Just be explicit about it. Say, oh, I think this person is anxious because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, cool. Just lay it out. It's a fake person. You can make up whatever you want about them. The main goal is to try to get practice into dividing complete control and incomplete control. So what I'm going to do is read the vignette, open it up for brief questions that only have to do with what you're about to go into the breakout sessions for, which is to try to get that 2 columns of complete control and not complete control for this fake person. You're going to do your breakout sessions, then you're going to come back and you can share what you found and also ask questions about this week's exercises. So that's the plan for the rest of my time here. So I'm going to read the vignette first. So the vignette at the beginning of week 1 states, "It's easy to think that we have control over our lives when things are going the way we want. But what happens when we experience uncertainty? Consider our friend Alice, who faces this question at her job. Her quarterly performance review is coming up, and though she's been doing well, a familiar anxiety floods her body as negative what-if scenarios cross her mind. Could learning more about what's really in her control help Alice, and what effect would that have on her psyche?" So that's the vignette, and you have 2 questions as well as the column exercises. So maybe when you work with your group in your breakout sessions, you can answer those questions. How do you think learning about control would help Alice in her specific situation? And what effect do you think that it would have on her psyche? Answer those questions, plus separate out what's in Alice's complete control versus not complete control. with the group and come up with something. But before we go to breakout sessions, I will ask people to use the hand raising feature by clicking participants and raising your hand, and Shrikant can help me out by taking a look and seeing if anybody's raised their hand for questions just about applying the dichotomy of control to this specific vignette, not anything more general than that at this time.
All right, folks. So if you have any questions, specific questions only about this exercise that you're about to do, you can either raise your hand in Zoom or type an exclamation mark in chat, and I'll call upon you to unmute yourself. Sanjay, go ahead. Sanjay is first.
Yes. Hi, Greg. So I just missed the, I mean, I heard you, but I wasn't able to jot down the notes on what you want. So I understood about Alice and their problem with her quarterly review. But in terms of what exactly do you want us to do with how to help her identify?
What is in Alice's complete control and what is Alice's not in Alice's complete control, given that she's right before her quarterly performance review, she's starting to get anxious about her performance review.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else has a question? Okay, looks like it's clear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do breakout rooms for 20 minutes. That make sense, Greg? Okay, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now for 20 minutes. You will automatically be getting into a breakout room and automatically be getting back here in 20 minutes. You'll get a 2-minute warning when it is about to stop. Okay, so here we go. All right, welcome back, folks. So Greg, floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so I don't have anything much more to offer besides to answer any questions you have, but I will review briefly what I'm suggesting you do over the next week or two and take it from there. So I suggest that you work with week one by looking at a specific event that happened in your past, like probably previous day or something like that. It should be emotionally salient. That helps either positively or negatively. But a lot of people have a better luck, I think, at first with the negative stuff. So take a specific event. So don't review the whole day, just a specific event within that day, and then try to break out what's under your complete control and what's not. And feel free to give yourself a little leeway. For instance, you could aim to have a conversation with somebody, and technically only your intent to do that is under your complete control, not actually having a conversation. But it's, you know, if it's like 99% possible that you're going to have the conversation, feel free to let yourself slide and maybe put a star next to it if you want. So, and the last thing I'll say about this suggested exercise is that it is meant to be a little bit difficult. If you actually go through and do this daily, which I suggest you do, because otherwise it's just not going to sink in as well, you're going to probably struggle with separating things out. And maybe you may not agree, like maybe you'll use Epictetus's categorization, and you may not agree with some things being under your control or not under your control. And that's fine. That's actually part of the point of the exercise. If you're struggling, if you're struggling but making progress, that's the ideal situation you want to be in to actually build the skill. If it's too easy, then at least you know you have the skill. And if it's too hard, then you may want to give yourself a little more leeway in how you do it. But if it's a struggle, that's actually perfect. That's what we're aiming for. And we're also aiming for questioning whether this stuff is true or not, to let it sink in one way or the other for you. So why waste your time with Stoicism if you think it's completely wrong? If you think it's partially wrong but salvageable, then you could readjust these criteria for your own liking. And if you think it's great, then it would have sunk in more because you would have applied it to your own life over the course of a week. So with that all being said, I'll open the floor to questions. I'll be a little more lenient about kind of answering the questions that, like if you have general questions, you can, but I would lightly suggest that we keep it on at least practical Stoicism and only theoretical questions if it's in the service of practice.
Excellent. So what we'll do is that I'm going to now line up people for questions. Everybody is welcome to share their takeaway from the breakout rooms, what the experience was. Try to keep it short and focus on questions. So, you can line up for questions in two ways. You can type in exclamation mark in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. So it's going to be Aaron and Joe next. Aaron, go ahead.
Hey, Greg, wonderful presentation. So one question I want to ask about Stoicism, is it under the Stoic tradition, should you be expanding the realm of things that are under your control? Like, does it preach that, like, if I have a boss that I don't like, I should work really hard so that I can become a boss? Or does Stoicism kind of support the idea that I should just come to inner complacency with my situation? So are you expanding your realm of influence, or are you just being complacent with your current realm of influence?
Definitely not the first, and pretty much not the second either. So,
Wow.
yeah, you definitely do not expand your influence per se. You don't aim for that. As for being complacent, that's kind of leads to like inaction in the world. And if you take a look at the historical Stoics, none of them were inactive. And so the question is, why were they doing that if they had this lazy philosophy where you're just supposed to sit back and not care? The answer is because they didn't have a lazy philosophy where you're supposed to sit back and not care. The actual goal and what you're going to be balancing, if you go through the book, this is more the area of the discipline of action. But the goal, so this is a 3-step training program, and what we're focusing on, the discipline of desire, is just to get you more resilient. And it clears the floor for you to then act in the world, but without clinging so much to the outcomes of those actions. But all of this is in service of you trying to act more in the world without getting emotionally distraught when things don't go your way. So the Stoic path of progress is actually to lower your passions first, these strong emotions that kind of take over our minds and get in the way of ourselves and our social bonds. But then we're going to go act and try to become better people and actually try to help out other people. But we do so with a better understanding that the outcomes aren't in our complete control, so we're not as emotionally upset. So that's the path of the Stoics. So it's neither complacency nor trying to expand the realm of control. The Stoics think that the realm of control is fixed and limited. It's a small set of things you completely can control. You could always try to place your happiness on getting your way for things that are not under your complete control, but then you're essentially putting your happiness at risk of the roll of the dice. And there's the Stoic argument that, there's nothing better than your character anyway, so why are you betting on things that are worth less that you're not going to get a guaranteed payout for?
Next is Joe, followed by Dan. Folks, you can line up for questions by typing exclamation mark or raising your hand. So it's going to be Joe, Dan, and Gretchen next. Joe, go ahead. Joe, you need to unmute yourself.
The cardinal virtues as another element to the dichotomy of control. So is that, but I find myself to be a little bit confused. It gets a little bit hard sometimes because I'm trying to map, all right, this is in my control. Is it wise? Am I demonstrating a justice? And I mean, is that a healthy way of doing it? Or is it better to just start with let's just start with dichotomy and control, get that down, and then maybe move into mapping virtue to all my actions?
So I don't know if I've read into your statement in question correctly. It sounds like you're a little bit confused about the process that you're currently undergoing, in which case I could probably have you answer your own question. Is it healthy for you?
Yeah. It's giving me insights, but it does get complex. It does get complex. But it does give me insights as well. So it's a balance, I guess. So
cool.
Yeah. So anyway.
One question you could ask yourself is there a way to approach what you're currently doing where you can keep the insights and get rid of the confusion? And that's at least an opening question to see if you could refine your process. But the question for is it healthy always pretty much comes down to, I don't know, have you tried it? And has it been healthy for you? Because different people will have different affinities for different kinds of processes.
Next up is Dan, Rachel, and Joel. Dan, go ahead.
Thanks. All right, Greg. In our breakout room, we had some interesting takeaways, like the employee Alice could think that, oh, this evaluation might be negative for me, but I've survived other evaluations in the past, therefore life will not end. She could also be on the positive side. She could think, maybe my evaluation will show me a mistake that I'm making and I'll improve. But overall, what I was thinking about is there a Stoic, maybe a Marcus quote or some concept that can help her overcome the general anxiety that she has in other words, maybe she can't dismiss it at all or completely, but maybe she can just reduce the the tension a little bit?
I don't know necessarily of a single quote. That depends on what resonates with Alice, but there's the example in Epictetus of the lyre player who gets anxious. There's an entire book in the Discourses on Anxiety, chapter in the Discourses on Anxiety, and yeah, and Epictetus gives the example of the lyre player who gets nervous. And so it serves as a nice reminder that you're focusing on, Epictetus says this is actually a symptom of an underlying disorder, which is that you're focusing on something outside of your control. So one thing you could say to yourself is like, oh, I'm focusing on something outside of my control because I'm anxious right now. What is that? And then see what you could do from there. As for a specific quote, I can't, that's too personal to, not like personal as in private, but like everybody, things will resonate with different people. So I would just encourage you to read and find something for yourself.
Next up is Gretchen, Joel, and R. Gretchen, go ahead.
Hi. So my question is like foreign language. I think you mentioned like first learning the alphabet and of a foreign language and etc. like that, instead of just throwing yourself into like another culture or language. Is this something that, you know, it's, if you practice it, you know, with something small and start with something small, that this is a habit that you can build, such as, for example, something that I would think is like 99% in my control is that, for one thing, like I want to have nice fingernails. I want them to look, I want them to be strong. And so, but I don't put fingernail polish on. So for me, it's like, okay, it's in my control to put fingernail polish on and keep it on, you know, stuff like that on a regular basis, maintain my fingernails. And so I get that down and I go, okay, I've got that practice down. I met a goal that was within that. And then is that something that, you know, like if you start with small things, that you build up your resilience or your ability to do more and more?
Yep, that's the idea. Yeah, Epictetus specifically recommends starting with the small things. So that is definitely wise, because if you can't go to the gym and bench press your body weight, twice your body weight to start out. So yeah, you actually intentionally do start with the small things. I do mention for this week's exercise to do something that is emotionally salient so that you can have some experience working with it. But in the chapter, we specifically say don't start anything too hard. And actually, ideally, you would kind of work your way up to harder things slowly over time, but start with the easy stuff, yeah.
Next up is R.
Yeah, I think my question is just having a clear understanding about things that are under my control and things that are not, because it seems a little bit more difficult sometimes when you sit down and look at an event, and it seems like it's under your control. When you try to connect the dots, eventually there's something comes in and say, well, now this is related to that event, and it wasn't really under my control. Like even simple things. So can we use some, like a guideline, anything that we can initiate ourselves is considered under our control?
Yep, that's exactly it. Anything that you could initiate yourself. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And the two other guidelines that were offered is the list that Epictetus gives, that your conscious thought or opinions, your impulse to act, and what you desire, like what your goals are. Those are all under your control. You can try sorting things into those buckets. You could also do the external internal thing, which, as I mentioned, isn't perfect, but may get you closer. Or you may discover other guidelines or rules of thumb that will at least help you. And I encourage you to look for yourself to see, or you could use the initiate yourself thing that you mentioned earlier, but play with it. And as I said, I'm almost happy to hear that you're struggling a little bit, because that means that practice, as long as it's not overwhelming, that means practice may actually benefit you. You'll get improvements from it if you try to focus and do this exercise repeatedly over the next week or two.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Mike, followed by Jeffrey. Mike, go ahead.
The thing that I got out of this is that in many respects the performance review is not about me, but about what the objectives of the organization are in doing the performance. And my part of it is to get a good score out of it, so I can get my business objectives done for the company, and maybe walk out with a reasonable raise by showing that I'm involved in the company. Now, in that thing and trying to map what's smart and in the SMART process that you said for planning, specific things, probably I divide in what I've done in the past, or what I'm going to do in the future, and what resources I expect to get in the future. Now, this is complicated by the fact that many organizations, they have what they call a 360 performance. You get reviewed by your boss, and not always though, and that's not as important as the reviewed by your peer group, your colleagues, and
Mike,
the people that might be working for you.
Mike, what's your question?
How do you map all that into the SMART process to come up with something useful?
So just to be clear, the SMART process was about actually doing this exercise each week. It wasn't about this specific exercise itself. It was to help you plan when to do it and to know that you're meeting your goals of doing the exercise. This exercise itself is all about sorting a thing that happened into in your control or not in your control. And so all the things that you mentioned, from possibly getting a raise to getting a good performance review to all that kind of stuff, that's in the not complete control column. So that's a pretty easy sussing. What I would encourage you to do, I didn't hear in your list is anything that was under Alice's complete control. And so it may be useful if you want to continue with the exercise to explore what is under her complete control, because you just listed a whole lot of things that you'd focus on. And the thing is, a lot of those things pretty much, I didn't hear a single instance of one that was under her complete control. So it'd be interesting if you could come up with some that are.
Well, how she presents those is how she picks the right things on the list depends on what her objectives are.
Okay, so her objectives are under her control. So that's a good one. Yep, that's the desires, aversions kind of thing. So cool. That's a good start.
So next one is Ayala, followed by Kavita. Ayala, go ahead.
Question is short. Are my desires, thoughts, and wants necessarily under my control?
What you initially aim for, yes. Depends on what you're looking for. So for instance, if you want to stop eating, if you want to like stop eating sweets, as many sweets as one normally does, or if Alice wanted to eat as many sweets, she could say, I don't want to eat sweets anymore. But then she could forget about it and pick up some sweets just because it slipped her mind. Or maybe she's under a lot of stress and will then go get sweets anyway. That doesn't mean her desire overall changed. Her aim is still to avoid sweets. It's just she's not meeting her aims as much. But the aim to avoid sweets, what is under her complete control? She could choose to say, I want to avoid sweets, or maybe she could choose to say, actually, you know what, I'm going to moderate it because this is too hard. Or maybe she could say, like, actually, I just want to eat sweets all the time because life's short. Those kinds of things that she's aiming for under her complete control. How she feels and whether she succeeds is not immediately under her complete control, although can get shaped over time. But that's not the goal of Stoic practice. The goal of Stoic practice is to work with those feelings and failures as they come up the best that you can.
Thank you, Greg. Next up is Kavita.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for the excellent presentation. That was wonderful. My question is about the external and the internal events that you mentioned when you were talking about making the list. So the internal events are how I react to the situation or my emotional control and stuff like that. And the external events will be whatever the boss's action would be, right? So is there any way that I can influence the external events? Like being a Stoic, can we ever influence the external events? Like just say this was actually, we were having a conversation in our group and this came up that if we come up with some reasons why the performance wasn't good, if it's going to be a bad review, that's why the person was anxious about, can she give them like reassurance saying that she is coming up with so many things that she's planning on doing in the future to better herself? So is it okay for a Stoic to influence the external events?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to influence external events, but Epictetus, this is a 3-step training program, and Epictetus recommends that one just work on reducing your desires first as part of your Stoic training. He explicitly says that the first part is to try to reduce your desires, and so if you go about it, you do it very lightly. Your goal is to not react so much when your desires don't get fulfilled for externals. There is the entire second discipline of Epictetus, the discipline of action, is about influencing external events. But Epictetus tells his students, he explicitly tells his students, if you don't get your passions down by working with this first discipline, you're not ready to do the second. Because things are going to get in your way. You're going to get upset, and you won't be as effectual as you could be and clear-headed in order to really think about that's the main focus. In a few weeks, we'll be getting some discipline of action exercises, but I would really recommend, I strongly agree with Epictetus's approach, that just focus on reducing desires and passions and reducing aversions for externals now. Don't ask that question, because that's a lot to bite off, and if you try to go about acting in the world, you probably will be less effectual if you don't have the passions under control first.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions? I have a couple of questions for kind of looking forward at the series. So can you give us some idea? So firstly, I encourage everybody to go out and get the book. I put the link in the chat. If you don't already have the book, please go ahead and get it. But let's finish the questions, and then we'll talk about what's coming up. Jeffrey, go ahead.
Yes. So I could use a little bit of clarification about how we have full control over our opinions or judgments. Or is that one of those things that you're saying gets gradually shaped, or is that an immediate thing that we supposedly have control over?
It's an immediate thing that you pretty much have control over, that you can consider things and see whether you buy into them or not initially. At least according to Stoic theory. Part of the exercise this week is to see whether that's actually true for yourself and to possibly reshape it if it's not.
Can you give like an example of a question that one might ask oneself to determine one's own opinion?
Right. So, for instance, I could say Jeffrey's confused right now, and I'm doing a really horrible job at explaining all this stuff. I am really bad at this and should probably just go and watch TV now. Bye. I'm going to leave. Bye. So those thoughts can come into my head, but I could say, well, hold up. Jeffrey's just asking a question. Is that interpretation the only interpretation? No, it's not. He could just be like maybe like I didn't explain it well for his specific set. Maybe he was watching TV himself and got distracted. I don't know. There's a whole lot of stuff that could be going on. But do I know that Jeffrey like specifically thinks that this presentation sucked? And also, does that mean, even if it does that mean that I suck because Jeffrey thinks I suck? No, not really. So I could sit down and kind of think that through. And cognitively at that point, and that takes a little bit of work, but cognitively at that point, I could say, well, it's true. Just because I don't know whether Jeffrey thinks this presentation sucked, I could ask him if I want the data. And also, even if he thinks I suck and everything sucks about me, then does that mean I suck? I'm sure your opinion holds a lot of weight, but it doesn't quite destroy my life. So, so I could cognitively believe that. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'll feel better if those things were going through my head. But what it does mean is that at least I say that initial thought, I don't buy it. That doesn't mean that I may not still feel sad, but with repeated practice that may change. But I do want to emphasize the point is not to make that feeling go away per se. The point is to repeatedly question your initial thoughts and come to a conclusion of whether you should buy those initial thoughts or not. Is that a decent example? Cool. Thanks.
Next up is Shelley, followed by Shane. Shelley, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. I am really enjoying this. My question is there a Stoic approach to reducing desires?
Yep, that's a lot of the rest of the first section of the book is that there's a lot of different exercises. And part of the goal of the book is to actually, what you do if you get the book is you do each exercise for a week. And the goal is not to then make you official Stoic where you get a Stoic certificate in the mail and you can frame it. The goal is to actually sample these exercises kind of like a smorgasbord, because all these exercises may not work for anybody, and there's a lot of exercises for that. And so at the end of each week, we actually have a little checkbox so you could keep track of what exercises you particularly like. And actually, after the end of the book, we then have you put together a simplified curriculum for yourself based off of what works best. So the answer is there's a lot of exercises. The first entire third of the book is devoted to them. And the point is to kind of explore to see what works for you. But some of the more famous ones are, like, for instance, acting the opposite. Whenever you desire something, walk away from it instead of going toward it. That's a simple, great exercise, very straightforward. But when you want something, walk away from it instead of going toward it. Do that for a couple of weeks, see how it feels. And see how the desire behaves as well. Other things are like meditating that you may lose the thing. Or meditating that it's impermanent, or breaking it down into its component parts so that instead of delicious cake, it is flour, sugar, and shortening. Things like that can help reduce desire, but those are all exercises to be explored in the first third of the book.
Greg, let me take this opportunity of asking you a question about the book, because all of us are going to be spending quite a bit of time with the book. So can you tell me about, the idea of the book? What are you trying to accomplish in the book, and what can the reader get from this book?
So the book is essentially a selection of specific Stoic exercises organized into the 3 disciplines of Epictetus, his 3-step training program that he has. So we've classified a bunch of Stoic exercises that are lifted from the literature, perhaps with some modification at some times, in order to give people a sampling of Stoic exercises to train in. The goal at the end of the book is if people work through the book in its entirety for the year, they will have a good idea of 2 things. First of all, whether Stoicism's for them in the first place, because it's a philosophy of life, and I think that you should probably spend some time taking it for a test drive. If you just do it a week of Stoicism and you're like, or maybe you do a week here and then forget about it while you go do something else and then come back for another week there, I don't know if that's really a fair judgment of it. So a year is a pretty good go. So you could either say, hey, this Stoicism stuff's great, or hey, I'm not going to ever pick up Stoic book again because I don't like this, in which case you've still won something because you've eliminated a significant thing that was not providing fruit for you, so why bother doing that? So you will also have a personalized Stoic curriculum at the end, because you will be keeping track of all the specific exercises that we go through, finding what works and what doesn't for you, and that varies from person to person. Then you'll put together a curriculum at the end of the book in order to start drilling it home and have a lifetime of practice.
Excellent, thank you. Next up is going to be Shane, followed by Sanjay. Shane, go ahead. Shane,
Hi.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say I love the book and thank you so much for this. I just wanted to share the very first part that I was having anxiety flying and going to the airport on the plane last week to Arizona. And maybe it just helps other people that being very simple and basic is just the first step. So, things out of my control were waiting in lines. Things in my control was wearing my mask. Out of control, people not wearing masks. In control, social distancing. Out of control, people not distancing. In control was saying it seemed right to them, and out of control was not getting the right rental car that I wanted. So I think it's just really simple, and thank you for the basic exercise. And I think the more that I practice, then the more I'll get it. And that's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Shane. Really appreciate that. Sanjay, next.
Yes, again, fantastic presentation. I've been trying to practice parts of Stoicism for a little bit, and one of the problems that before I go into the problem, let me just say that I think that Stoicism can work for a lot of people. One of the things that's essential to understand is that if we look at a concept from Daniel Kahneman about system 1 versus system 2 thinking, the slow brain, fast brain, or the emotional reactive way of behaving versus the cognitive analytical thinking. And people who have developed some bit of cognitive strength, who can think through things and withhold a reactive, very, very strong reactive force, can do better. But this can again be developed. So that's really where my question lies, is that for things which bring out a reaction immediately, what I try to do is, and these things take time because you're basically retraining your brain. So in the beginning, I would try to, think through it and see, and my mind would be diverted. Your emotions make your mind go off onto other thoughts or to do other things, actually not to do what you want to do, focus on the things in control. And so eventually I would realize that after a minute or two, and then I would try to push myself back. But I realized that wasn't the best thing. But I realized I just let my mind go and not think about it for a little bit, and then come back a few minutes later or an hour later. What are your take on these?
Yeah, you're finding it useful, so that can be useful. Those kind of techniques are, they're a lot more fine-grained than it's in the first third of the book, and I would kind of place them under the discipline of assent, which is later on in the book. It's the final icing on the cake discipline. It covers the first two disciplines of desire and action, but it does so at a more fine-grained level. So yeah, I don't have anything to critique or add to that, besides that I'm glad that you're noticing additional things that could be useful for you, because as you gain experience in Stoicism, it becomes useful to kind of tweak and add exercises. And so I'm happy to hear that you're doing so successfully.
Wonderful. We're coming to the end of the time that Greg has. So Greg, I'm going to give you the last word. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to go into one more round of breakout rooms to kind of plan out what we are going to do. Actually, let's have a discussion after that. So Greg, any last words, any last thoughts?
So when you go into your breakout room, like the main goal is to actually come up with a plan of practice to share it with each other. I guess it's out of my control what you guys do. You could be talking about the ending of Lost and how terrible it was. It was a very bad ending, but I encourage you to at least try to go and try to plan out practically how you're going to practice over the course of the week, how much is achievable for you, and how will you know whether you met your practice goals or not. Besides that, what I'm currently aiming to do right now is to go on to week 2 in a couple of weeks. And so Shrikant and I will probably discuss offline our plans for going forward, because I know he's also going to be leading a couple of exercises, but I think week 2 it would be better if I covered myself, because it's actually a little confusing as it's written in the book, and going through it could be useful. So that's my intended next exercise to cover, maybe next, but I'm going to be doing it. I'm going to be coming back in 2 weeks, so maybe Shrikant and I will discuss offline in the future. Next week's exercise, we may jump ahead and then come back or something like that. We'll see. But otherwise, this is going to be challenging a little bit if you actually sit down and do it. And remember that that's part of the goal. You'll be able to challenge the assumptions of Stoicism, adapt them for your own needs, and also see how it manifests in your own life and whether it's useful for you. And this is just the beginning. So with that, happy practicing, and I will see you in a couple of weeks if all goes as planned.